adapted to the local context. So it's pretty well understood by the communities. On the other hand, the problem with that fund is that it's limited for the moment to benefit sharing to communities, so it could not cater for channeling benefits to other types of stakeholders. And it's only limited to forest concessions because these funds are created within the forest concessions. And I mean, although it's already an interesting model in terms of governance, there's still a lot of efficiency and to be improved. So what are the lessons learned from our work? So maybe the first lesson is that when channeling REDD+ funding or other type of REDD+ related money, may they be performance-based or not, an incentive approach would need to be taken, because as we have seen in the experience of the Local Development Fund, the distribution of money is according to a pre-negotiated distribution key, so it's not really, which is in that sense also a bit arbitrary. So it's not really related to the performance or specific incentives for different types of stakeholders or different types of benefits for different types of stakeholders. So it's pretty static in a way. It's a percentage of revenue and that's it, and it's distributed in an equal way. So it would be interesting to look at how these funds maybe could be accommodated to a mix of incentives. To look at how specific activities could be supported. And one example is smallholder cocoa production, which is currently being envisaged in the north of the country as an income-generating activity. Also, we've looked at the way these funds were responding to community needs, and it's important to take into account the different type of needs of the communities, because depending on the level, depending on the group of stakeholders, these needs might widely vary, and this fund so far has not been able either to accommodate these different type of needs. For example, the preparation of community development plans could be a good idea, a good vehicle for catering these different needs and doing sort of a diagnosis beforehand. And eventually, there's a need to balance equity with performance. These sort of jurisdictional approaches that are currently being developed, such as the emission reduction programs that is foreseen in the north, offers a good opportunity to test that tool. But obviously, the payments would be significantly scaled up, and they would be linked to performance. So there's a really important need of capacity building of people who would potentially facilitate the use of those funds. And these capacitators need not only to be the state, because local government has very little capacity. We can also envisage third party and, for example, local NGOs to support the community in doing that. And finally, we obviously need to make sure that the safeguards that are in place are adapted to the level that are required for REDD+. So making sure that the legal framework takes into account the new development that are linked to REDD+ and to this performance approach. Ensure obviously that there are complaint mechanisms in place, which is not currently the case, and that any new development is based on consultation and FP. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adeline, for sharing the case of DRC in Congo. She has shown that this can be built on existing models, but then she pointed it out that there are needs to adapt to the existing mechanism to say when it has to address performance-based issues. Now I would like to turn to Ami Michel, who will be presenting. This is the most intensive research part of the panel. sharing data and findings from 6 countries and different villages and households.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Hi, I'm Amy Duchel from the Center for International Forestry Research in Indonesia, and I'm a scientist there and I've been working on RED since about 2009. Through C4's big global comparative study on RED, maybe some of you are familiar with it. And today I just want to present two sort of sides of the coin of this benefit sharing issue, and one is taking it from kind of a broad review of former benefit sharing or current benefit sharing mechanisms that may have nothing to do with RED. Programs like conditional cash transfers, payment for environmental service programs, other FLECT, all kinds of different governance structures that our scientists, a team of scientists did a review of hundreds of these across all tropical countries and came up with some sort of general lessons for national benefit sharing mechanisms to be able to reach down to the local level in efficient, equitable and efficient ways. So as I present some of these summary results, it would be interesting for each of you to think of your own context where these work, or where you work, and how these resonate with you, if this seems to make sense. This is from the review of hundreds of studies. A few lessons for effectiveness. First, this idea of performance indicators. In their review, they found that a lot of these performance indicators that were chosen for the different kinds of projects, whether they were payments for environmental services or cash transfers, were based on, to be efficient, often the indicators were not necessarily very informative. They might be number of visits to a local health center, but no measures of what that actually meant for the health of the people on the ground. Things like this. So the importance of selecting indicators and how challenging that is actually to really measure performance. And the use of existing governance systems to reduce costs. This is, Adeline highlighted this very nicely with these local development banks in the case of the DRC. And this, you can think about this in your own context and how that can work. You know, with a bit of caution about not reinforcing existing corruption measures and maybe elite capture, that, you know, sort of trying to think about how to potentially make RED a bit transformative in terms of local governance. Involving local government, I mean, needless to say, as the closer you get to the ground, the more people are actually involved. You have multi-stakeholder processes, you have local communities, indigenous people, the private sector at that very local level that can actually, they're talking to each other. And this is really where the change happens, the importance of involving local governments. And this coordination both vertically across sectors and horizontally. And one of the interesting recommendations that came up from this review was the idea of having a coordinating body in the benefit sharing mechanism, with the caution that, you know, not creating too much of a centralized, potentially corrupt body, but this idea of some institution that's actually coordinating across sectors and across levels of governance. Efficiency, this idea of role of intermediaries, and an important example that was highlighted was this national fund for forest financing in Costa Rica that manages their national PES program, Payment for Environmental Service program, which is really important. The issues of addressing scale and actually getting down to the local level in an efficient, a cost-efficient way. Using geographical targeting to increase effectiveness and efficiency. And one of the interesting recommendations that came out of this report was avoiding areas of high opportunity costs. So maybe in the case of Indonesia, it's a little bit complicated, avoiding these areas where you would have to really offset costs of maybe oil palm. My opinion on that is maybe not avoiding those areas, but thinking of special strategies for those areas, because those are often the areas where deforestation is most intense. Cattle ranchers in Brazil, oil palm producers in Indonesia. We can't just avoid these areas, but there may be special strategies if you want to be cost efficient. And then clarifying tenure based on the nature of the ecosystem service. Equity, this idea of setting fair payments and payment structures. and actually thinking of the pros and cons of cash payments in different contexts. Most of my experience is in the Brazilian Amazon, and many communities there have told us during our research, please tell these groups to stop giving us cash payments, because by the time we actually travel to the nearest city, open up a bank account, go through all the bureaucracy of accessing the cash, we've actually lost money in the whole deal, because the cash, it's just not enough of a payment, and the cost of everything outweigh this. So please tell them to give us other kinds of incentives and ask for our opinions about these incentives. And then these local perceptions of equity matter, and that again, people are not only motivated by economic factors, but a host of other factors, and paying attention to multiple benefits. And here, focusing on co-benefits and securing rights, and asking people for their local recommendations. I mean, it's just remarkable. I'll show a slide from our very local level research how people aren't actually consulted in a meaningful way about what might actually change their behavior, what kinds of benefits they would like to see. So this is where I go to the very local level of what we've done in 6 countries and 22 subnational RED initiatives, 150 villages and 4,000 households. 6 of those sites are in Indonesia. My Indonesian colleagues are working on this. And what we did was basically in 2010 went to all of these villages and households and had meetings with village groups, women's groups, all households, asking about livelihoods, land use, participation, all kinds of indicators. And then we went back 3-4 years later to ask the same set of questions, and actually also do this with remote sensing methods, to see change over time. And in both livelihood indicators, participation indicators, tenure indicators, and deforestation indicators. And just 2 things that I wanted to highlight for you here today, or 3 things actually. The first is that when you actually get to the ground level at these RED sites, the presence of performance-based payments is very limited. You actually have a big mix of interventions. So this is the number of interventions in the different countries and divided by category. So enabling conditions are the activities that are really important for RED readiness: tenure clarification, environmental education. Disincentives are the classic command control. That's been very important in Brazil for reducing deforestation, just environmental fines, and they fly over the Amazon with helicopters and actually are measuring deforestation. This has been important. We see it also happening in Indonesia in a different way. This regulatory measures are part of the package. And then incentives. There's a diversity of incentives that we found at the sites where we work, but most of those are not actual cash payments. Those are many different kinds of other measures to enhance livelihoods and potentially make land use behaviors more sustainable, I would say. Some of the tenure security outcomes. So it's hard to see the colors, but on the left is the data from 2010, and on the right is the data from 2014. And this is essentially the percentage of hectares of land at this household level, remembering that we're talking with 4,000 households, 4,000 farmers, and asking them about their tenure security change over time. And interestingly, in Cameroon and in Brazil, the security of agricultural lands in Cameroon and the security of forest lands in Brazil, in Cameroon the security went up over time, in Brazil the security went down over time, but where tenure clarification was a major priority in both of those cases, those households reported higher tenure security over time. Very interestingly, in Indonesia, tenure security on both agricultural and forest lands was perceived as more secure in 2014 than 2010, but not related to any sort of land zoning or tenure clarification type activities on the ground. So maybe the panelists and others who know the Indonesian context might know why that happened. Why do people think their tenure is more secure now than they did 4 years ago in these villages? And that's very important for benefit sharing. If people don't have secure rights, this will affect how benefits are distributed. Participation outcomes are also very important. This is what I was referring to before. In 2010, when we were asking people if they were aware of the RED interventions in their villages, the women's group were less knowledgeable than the men's groups, or the mixed village groups. And the households were less knowledgeable also. The remote households had never heard of things. They may have not gone to meetings. But then when we went back 4 years later, we found that actually people were aware of the initiatives, and it's pretty even over the village groups, the women's groups, and the households that we interviewed. But importantly, participation had increased, in the villages and women's groups and households, but it was much lower for women than for these mixed groups. And so this importance of involving women, and I would say also, when we look at the kinds of participation, most of the people who were participating were going to a meeting about the project and just listening to the project. That's how they participated. They didn't actually have any chance to say, give any feedback or give any ideas of the type of benefit sharing mechanisms that were being implemented. So a few take-home messages for the design of national red benefit sharing mechanisms. The effectiveness depends on governance. It depends on rigorous monitoring, but again, how are you going to define the indicators for performance, and how are you going to really involve local people in that process? These are the challenges. Efficiency, managing issues of scale, bundling and targeting, especially at the local level, might be able to increase cost efficiency. Assessing who benefits and structuring payments or other incentives to address local equity can involve trade-offs with efficiency. The more local you get and the more customized the interventions become that we argue are important for equity, the more expensive this is going to be. When you consult local people, every consultation and all the feedback and all of this customization really does take time and money, and budgets need to be able to account for this. And then this mix of benefits and instruments, in many cases, indirect and non-cash benefits are important. And as I said before, sometimes cash benefits, people don't want those. So it's really important to understand the local context. And an inclusive multi-stakeholder process is critical for ownership across multiple levels, legitimacy and sustainability. There are wonderful examples of this where I work in the Brazilian Amazon of multi-stakeholder processes at the subnational jurisdictional level, so at the province and district, state, municipality, that level, you can really start to see some very interesting multi-stakeholder processes that involve many actors, including local communities, in defining these mechanisms. So thank you very much. Here are some links to our work, and I encourage you to please get in touch with us if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy, for sharing. I think we like the way you structure into the notion of efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. We open the floor for questions. I think 3-4 questions, very short and concise. The lady in red. 4. Yes, please.
Thank you all for your presentations. I'm Judith Kamoto from Malawi. I would like to learn from the presentation where we have countries where women or men are complaining that they travel a long time to get money from benefit sharing. And I just wanted to know whether in those countries they have used any of the mobile services like M-Pesa in Tanzania and mobile money in other countries. Thank you.
We connect all the questions first. Sorry, yes. And then you.
Hi, I'm Steve Epstein from the BBC Media Action. I had a question for the panel about how, about how both interfacing with village law and Red Plus generally is communicated to users, and how you use different techniques or methods to ensure that it is inclusive and understandable, and also taps into things that the community can be motivated by and can really understand. So different routes that you choose to be able to do that, and then this is
Thank you.
Thank you. This is my question for Mr. Budiman. My name is Ade Zuri from Indonesia Green Union. Until 2014, Indonesia palm oil plantation has increased to 13.5 billion hectare and more 12.17 ton per year for pulp and paper production and other extractive industry like oil, gas, mining with large scale has destroyed not only natural resource in the village but also culture and local initiative in the village. And now with new scheme, they replace. They is palm oil plantation, a big company. They replace the base with the green project organization, with conservation project, restoration project. But the meaning is still same: is to grab local community land, forest and natural resource. Now Indonesia Green Union developed two programs. One, green village development and green school to make sure participation and local community in the village and to rebuild village caused by land grabbing and large-scale investment. Especially for Pak Budiman, I give recommendation fund for village, not only to build an infrastructure only, but for rebuild local community, local space. Thank you.
Okay, the last question. Second, okay, then you will give it.
Zulkira from WWF Indonesia. Thank you very much for presentations. It's very inspiring. The first question is the incentive. Where is the basis of incentive? Yeah, whether because the community promised to develop something and it makes sense, or incentive because the community already produced something. Yeah. Then what is the indicators of measuring on that? Yeah. Now the second question is, incentive of course is very important, yeah, to alleviate the improvement of the village development. Yeah. But then the next step, even more important, yeah, what the use of incentive? Is it really to improve the local development, village development, or is it just go for consumptive needs of the community? Yeah. So whether there are lessons from Congo, for example, as well as from Indonesia, yeah, whereby the successful next phase of incentive already occurring for lessons. Thank you.
I think the question is well taken now. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Arianish from Ethiopia. My question goes to Adi. From your point of presentation, you mentioned that the forest sector of Congo is when the most regulated and advanced. So, how do you face currently the livelihood demand of the forest that you face? My second question is, what type of approach are you using? Thank you.
Yes, we have a lot of questions. It is very short, concise, and we'll take another one.
Okay, thank you very much for your nice presentations. I think it's formative presentation. My name is Yamlaksra, I'm from Ethiopia. My question is goes to Indo, if I'm not mistaken, Indo. I am really wondering about the local development fund in Congo. So if I'm not mistaken, I heard that annually they contribute just to keep the forest. annually they contribute. So I'm wondering, and I would like to know the mechanism or the system, how this community can contribute just to protect the forest.
Thank you very much for the question. I think the first can be answered by the question is on what the management like to extract.
Maybe I just heard 3 questions that I think I can respond to, and then I'll pass the microphone down. I think the first one is from this colleague from Malawi. This is, I give the example from the Amazonian context where communities are very, very remote, and I think this is very different than maybe other parts of the world. It can take a week going by river for some of these communities to actually get to any sort of center where there might be a bank or even a mobile phone type access. So this is the context that I was referring to was a situation where really the payment, the idea of a payment, and combined with the Brazilian bureaucracy of how to actually receive a cash payment, and it has to be through this legal framework at a bank in a certain way. You have to have certain documentation. It doesn't really match with the reality of these people. And so that was when they were saying, can we think of something else to incentivize us to not cut down forests? But I think this would be interesting to hear about this Tanzania idea in a different context. And then this new direction, I'm sure Pakuriman will talk more about the idea of communicating RED. But I think what we've seen in our research on sort of knowledge of the initiatives and participation in the initiatives is that people really do not understand these concepts when they're presented. I mean, they're often presented in very technical ways. I mean, think of all of us, we're here, we're in the part of this international community, and it's very hard to understand what RED is. I mean, think about the first time you were learning about RED Plus and carbon markets. I mean, it took me a long time to really understand what this meant and how it could work. Imagine people who don't have a very different reality and are connected to the land in a very different way. So I guess what we've seen, we're not necessarily communicating RED because we're sort of studying how RED is being communicated, but I think the best cases are when you actually involve leaders from the community or educators from the community in translating these concepts. So those are the cases that I've been most inspired by, where actually NGOs and communities are working together to develop the messages for these concepts to bring those then to the broader group of people. Those are the most interesting cases. And then finally, this idea of incentives. I think from the colleague from WWF, I think the incentives that we're looking at, they're both incentives to compensate people for other things that are being taken away from them. I think in the case that we've seen, there's a lot of this push for the end to shifting cultivation or Swidden agriculture, and that's very, very tough for communities who have relied on that system for decades. And so without the proper incentives to make that transition, we've seen that people are put in very, very vulnerable positions. In the Brazilian Amazon, there's a lot of, people will say, okay, you're legally not allowed to clear land and burn it next year because there was too much fire the year before. Well, they don't actually have the technical assistance to then grow rice, and then they end up having to go to the city and buy rice. And these are people who don't have those kinds of resources available. So it's a really serious food security issue. And so there are incentives to compensate that, I guess. But then there's also these incentives that are looking for, I would say, more than trying to really promote development. I would say what we've seen in the sample, there are incentives to really change this development model. So a different land use type of model. And the best case is working with local farmers to determine how that can best be done.
Thanks a lot for the questions. Maybe first the question on communication. I'll just respond from a really individual point of view across my personal development experience. But I think maybe to further develop what Amy was saying, I think my first probably lesson is not to talk about red, because it doesn't translate in anything easily for communities. It's very difficult to explain, and it's usually more confusing than anything else. So I would rather, I mean, in our experience, what we've always tried to do is really to target the individual interest of the specific stakeholders we are working with. So if it's, for example, slash and burn agriculture or wood energy, while concentrating the communication and the discourse on that specific practice and some of the environmental impacts that are related to that practice, or social impacts that are related to the practice, but that people can directly relate to. So, for example, the disappearance of a specific food supply in the forest, or loss of soil fertility because of a certain practice. Like, think really concrete things, and not necessarily link it to carbon emissions or that sort of other things which really don't have much value on the ground at this stage. I think it's also very important to understand everyone's interest in the process and in specific activities that one wants to implement, and we found in our experience that in many cases it's very important to take into account trade-offs for local leaders or for a certain group of stakeholders, such as women or the youth, and really try to see to appeal to those specific interests in the communication strategy. Obviously, the use of local facilitators is really important, trying to find some educated people in the village, in the communities, professors, people working at the church, whoever has a higher level of education, and that can be used as a facilitator and a communicator, and who's staying on the ground to further disseminate and can be a point of reference for the community. And maybe in terms of tools, it's really interesting to investigate innovative communication tools. In our experience, for example, we worked in community in the DRC with songs, working with a local orchestra to compose and play a song on the music of a traditional song from the area and song in local language. And that proved really great to disseminate, obviously, very general messages, because it's difficult to explain detailed things through singing, but at least for like broad communication messaging, it was really worked really well. On the two questions from the ladies from Ethiopia, thanks a lot. Just to clarify, the local development fund in the Congo at the moment. So I mentioned, yes, it's from our literature review, and these are the most developed across all sectors in the country. So that's why we decided it was an interesting example to further look at, because their existence is written in the forest code, the way they're working, the contribution, the compulsory contribution from the companies, all that is in the law, so it's pretty well complied with. So there's money in the pot, and there's already some lessons learned from how that has been used. But it's essentially, so far, it's only a compensation mechanism. So it's a compensation mechanism for the loss of access to natural resources by the communities who lived in the concession area. So it's not actually incentivizing anything. It's just compensating, and that's one of the limitations of it. And I suppose that's also why the country wants now to move towards developing RED Plus activities, developing a RED Plus strategy. It's developing in an area an emission reduction program to try to embed incentives within their policies and go beyond that compensation, but incentivize activities to reduce, for example, slash and burn agriculture. And one of the examples that I put up on the slides was they're thinking about mechanisms to incentivize small-scale cocoa production, for example, to increase local revenues, but there's many other examples. So for the moment, there's no, I mean, this local development fund does not cater for incentives to protect the forest at the moment. But hopefully in the future, and that's what we have been looking at, it could be used as a channel to trigger funding and activities that go into that direction.
Yeah, concerning the issue of the communicating the ideas of the benefit sharing and preserving the environment, actually we can use technology. We already practice it in some areas, in remote areas in Kalimantan, in Borneo. There are some villages in remote areas that we can give them the big picture of their existing environmental conditions by training them to operate, even to make drone by making participatory mapping through drone, and by taking some pictures and data from drone that we can find over 1 hour. It covers around 500 hectares of their own villages. Only 1 hour. By taking up data, and we make some thematic and visual mapping. And then thematic mapping. By identifying some areas for forest, and paddy fields and river, and they can identify the protected areas, and they put those data as the reference for the people to get involved in the deliberative process. By coming to agreement about the size or the scale of the protected areas, they can also submit the benefit sharing they can get from the state fund, from the village fund allocated by state. So by putting the data as the reference, as one of the reference in the deliberative process, we minimize and reduce the polemic or the pro-cons that based on subjectivism. So from our experience in Kalimantan and in some areas in Western Java, actually the villagers, they can easily grasp the use and the benefit of this technology, participatory mapping technology through drone, flying drone, by mapping, only 1 hour. And we can also train them to make those drones. That's very simple. And even in province of Kalimantan Barat or Western Kalimantan, they use this map by communities as the reference to make up land use planning, station planning at the province level. Kalimantan Barat is the only province in Indonesia that used this map that created or made by those villages through participatory process by using the technology of drone. That's so I think it's not so complicated if we can give them assistance and facilitate the process. So the key factor is the facilitators and communicators, either university or some NGOs. And secondly, question raised by Ade, yes, this is very important for us. It's very important to give since very beginning the green knowledge of those villagers, because it's the first year to allocate village fund for those people. I think since very beginning it's very important to give the green awareness to those villagers. So the role played by NGOs like you, Green Union or Red Cross or etc. can be very useful for the coming program of the village development. And about the incentives of benefit sharing, I think Edlin said that it's maybe quite limited. On a recent context, by allocating village fund, actually the benefit can be big. For next year, at least $100,000 allocated 2016. And 2019 it's around $200,000 per villages.
and smoke is in the air. We're choking on the water, our days are upside down. The clock is ticking, the sky is turning gray. The children are losing their smile, their dreams are gone away. If we don't believe it, if we just ignore it, let me tell you something, we will not survive it. Have yourself to save you from yourself. Don't wait till it's too late, move yourself to relate. The chain is free. Give your love to Mother Earth, just like Mother Earth loves you. Give your love to Mother Earth, just like Mother Earth loves you. Give your love to Mother Earth, just like Mother Earth loves you. Give your love to Mother Earth, just like Mother Earth loves you. Give your love to Mother Earth, just like Mother Earth loves you. Give your love to Mother Earth, just like Mother Earth loves you.